The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the red rope barriers. Among them stood the Morrison family from Chicago, their cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. 12-year-old Tyler Morrison bounced on his toes, his designer sneakers squeaking against the stones as he pushed through the crowd. "Tyler, stay close to us," his mother Sarah called out. But her voice was drowned by the excited chatter of hundreds of visitors. Tyler barely heard her anyway. He was too focused on getting the perfect shot for his social media accounts, determined to show his friends back home that he had gotten closer to the royal guards than anyone else ever had. The Morrison family had money, and Tyler knew it. His father owned several successful tech companies, and Tyler was used to getting whatever he wanted whenever he wanted it. Back home, his tantrums could clear entire restaurants. Store managers would bend over backwards to please the family, just to avoid scenes. Tyler had learned early that making enough noise usually got him his way. As the ceremony began, the iconic red-uniformed guards marched into formation. Their black bearskin hats stood tall and proud, their faces stone-like beneath the shadow of their ceremonial headgear. Guard James Mitchell, a 20-year-old veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Household Division, took his position near the palace gates. He had been performing ceremonial duties for 3 years, and he took immense pride in upholding the traditions that stretched back centuries. James stood perfectly still, his rifle held at precisely the correct angle, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He had trained for months to achieve this level of discipline. The weight of his uniform, the heat building under his bearskin hat, the ache in his feet from standing motionless for extended periods, none of it mattered when he was on duty. He represented something bigger than himself, the crown, the nation, and hundreds of years of military tradition. Tyler watched the guards with growing frustration. No matter how he positioned his phone or how loudly he called out, none of the guards would look at him or acknowledge his presence. Back home, adults always paid attention to him. Teachers, store clerks, restaurant staff, they all knew who he was and made sure to give him special treatment. But these guards acted like he didn't exist. "This is boring," Tyler announced loudly to his parents. "They're just standing there like statues. What's the point?" His mother shushed him gently. "It's a tradition, sweetie. They're not supposed to move or talk. That's what makes it special." But Tyler wasn't satisfied with that explanation. He had flown halfway around the world for this vacation, and he expected it to be entertaining. The guards were ruining his experience by being so boring and unresponsive. In his 12-year-old mind, they were being deliberately difficult just to annoy him. As the ceremony continued, Tyler's frustration grew. He watched other tourists taking pictures and seeming satisfied with distant shots, but Tyler wanted more. He wanted something unique, something that would impress his friends and get him likes on social media. The red rope barriers suddenly seemed like nothing more than suggestions rather than actual boundaries. When his parents became distracted by the pageantry of the ceremony, Tyler saw his opportunity. He ducked under the rope and began walking toward the guards. The crowd behind him gasped and pointed, but Tyler ignored them. He was focused on Guard Mitchell, who stood closest to where Tyler had been standing. "Hey," Tyler called out as he approached. "Hey, guard guy, look at me." James heard the boy's voice, but maintained his position. He had dealt with overeager tourists before. Usually, other security personnel would handle the situation before it escalated. He kept his eyes forward and his expression neutral, trusting that someone would redirect the child back to the designated area. But Tyler wasn't like most tourists. When the guard didn't respond, he felt personally insulted. Back home, when Tyler spoke, people listened. When he wanted attention, he got it immediately. This guard was disrespecting him by ignoring him, and Tyler wasn't going to stand for it. "I'm talking to you," Tyler shouted, now standing just a few feet away from James. "Don't ignore me. My dad could buy this whole place." The crowd behind the barriers grew larger as word spread about the American boy who had crossed into the restricted area. Phones came out and began recording. Some tourists looked worried. Others seemed excited to witness some drama during their visit to London. James felt his jaw tighten slightly. but he maintained his composure. He had heard worse during his military service. A spoiled child's tantrum wasn't going to break his professional demeanor. However, he was becoming concerned that the situation might escalate if security didn't intervene soon. Tyler interpreted the guard's continued silence as defiance. In his world, when people didn't respond to his demands, it meant they needed more pressure applied. He had seen his father handle difficult employees and business partners. Sometimes you had to be tougher to get what you wanted. You're just a fake soldier in a stupid costume. Tyler yelled, his voice carrying across the courtyard. You probably can't even fight. You're just here to look pretty for tourists. The words hit James harder than he expected. His thoughts flashed to his fallen comrades from Afghanistan, to the friends who hadn't made it home, to the nightmares that still sometimes woke him in the middle of the night. This wasn't just ceremonial duty for him. It was a continuation of his service, a way to honor his country and his fallen brothers. But James was a professional. He had sworn an oath, and part of that oath meant maintaining dignity even in the face of disrespect. He breathed slowly and evenly, using techniques he had learned during his military training to manage stress and maintain focus under pressure. Tyler, however, was just getting started. The guard's continued silence only fueled his anger. He had never encountered an adult who wouldn't eventually give in to his demands, and he wasn't going to let this be the first time. My dad has more money than your whole stupid country, Tyler screamed, his face red with frustration. You have to listen to me. I'm an American citizen. You work for me? By now, Palace security was moving through the crowd, but Tyler was too focused on his confrontation with the guard to notice. His parents had finally realized what was happening and were calling his name desperately. But Tyler was beyond listening to anyone. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded. Many had never seen such disrespectful behavior toward the Queen's Guard, and they weren't sure what would happen next. The guards were famous for their discipline and their ability to remain motionless despite distractions. But this was something different entirely. James could feel sweat beading on his forehead beneath his bearskin hat. But it wasn't from the heat. The boy's words were testing every ounce of his training and self-control. He thought about his grandfather, who had served in the same regiment during World War II, and about the pride his family took in his service. He wouldn't let them down, no matter what this child said or did. The moment stretched on, with Tyler becoming increasingly agitated and the crowd growing larger and more restless. Something was about to happen. Everyone present could feel the tension building like electricity in the air before a storm. Tyler Morrison stood face to face with Guard Mitchell, his small fists clenched at his sides as his shouting grew louder and more aggressive. The crowd behind the barriers had swelled to nearly 300 people, all with their phones pointed toward the unfolding drama. Social media notifications were already pinging across platforms as videos of the American boy's outburst began, spreading online. You're nothing but a toy soldier, Tyler screamed, his voice cracking with preteen fury. My dad could hire 1,000 people like you to work in his companies. You probably don't even make minimum wage standing here like an idiot. James Mitchell felt every muscle in his body tense, but years of military training kept him frozen in place. His breathing remained steady and controlled, even as the child's words cut deeper than any insult he had faced during combat deployments. The boy was attacking not just him personally, but everything he represented and everyone who had served alongside him. Palace security officers were finally pushing through the crowd, but the dense pack of tourists made their progress slow. Protocol dictated that they handle civilian disturbances with minimal force, especially when children were involved. The last thing anyone wanted was an international incident over an unruly American tourist. Sarah Morrison had broken through the crowd and was desperately trying to reach her son. Tyler, get back here right now, she called out, her voice filled with panic and embarrassment. She could see the phones recording everything. She knew this was going to be a public relations nightmare for her husband's companies, but Tyler was beyond reason now. The guard's refusal to acknowledge him felt like the ultimate disrespect, and his 12-year-old brain couldn't process why his usual tactics weren't working. At home, when he threw tantrums, adults scrambled to appease him. Store managers offered discounts, restaurant staff brought free desserts, teachers gave him extensions on assignments. Why wasn't this working here? Look at me when I'm talking to you, Tyler demanded, stepping even closer to James. I said, look at me. Don't you know who I am? My family owns half of Chicago. We could buy this whole stupid palace and turn it into a shopping mall. The crowd gasped collectively as Tyler raised his hand as if to push the guard. James saw the movement in his peripheral vision and had to fight every instinct in his body not to react defensively. His military training screamed at him to neutralize the threat. An elderly British woman named Margaret Thompson, who had been visiting the palace with her granddaughter, stepped forward from the crowd. Mrs. Thompson was 78 years old, and she had watched her city burn during World War II, had seen real soldiers return from real battles, and she had deep respect for those who served their country. Young man, Mrs. Thompson said in a voice that carried decades of authority, that guard you're shouting at served in Afghanistan. He risked his life for his country while you were probably playing video games in your comfortable American bedroom. Tyler spun around to face her, his anger now redirected. Mind your own business, old lady. This has nothing to do with you. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't intimidated by a spoiled child. She had raised 5 children and helped raise 12 grandchildren. She had dealt with tantrums before, though none quite as public or aggressive as this one. It has everything to do with me, she replied calmly. That young man represents my country, my queen, and everyone who has ever worn the uniform. You're not just disrespecting him, you're disrespecting every person who has ever served and died for what's right. The crowd began murmuring in agreement. Other British tourists started stepping forward, forming a protective semicircle around Guard Mitchell. They might not be able to interfere directly with the ceremonial duties, but they could certainly make their feelings known about this American. The crowd was no longer just watching entertainment, they were actively disapproving of his actions. But instead of backing down, his privileged upbringing kicked in even harder. He had been taught that when people opposed him, he just needed to assert his superiority more forcefully. You people are all jealous because America is better than your stupid country. Tyler shouted at the gathering crowd. We saved you in World War II. You should be thanking us, not protecting some fake soldier in a costume. The crowd's murmur turned into an angry rumble. Mrs. Thompson's eyes flashed with a fire that hadn't been there moments before. Her husband had served in the Royal Navy during the war, and several of her friends had lost loved ones defending. Britain against fascism. My husband spent 3 years fighting Nazi submarines in the North Atlantic, she said, her voice rising with emotion. He came home with frostbite scars and nightmares that lasted 40 years. Don't you dare tell me about fake soldiers, you spoiled little brat. James Mitchell, still frozen in his ceremonial position, felt something he hadn't experienced in years of guard duty. He felt protected by his community, supported by the very people he had sworn to serve. The crowd of British citizens wasn't just defending him personally, they were defending the institution he represented and the sacrifices made by countless service members throughout history. Tyler's father, Robert Morrison, finally broke through the crowd and saw the scene unfolding. He was a successful businessman who had built his fortune through aggressive negotiation and intimidation tactics. But even he could see that this situation was spiraling out of control. Videos of his son's meltdown were probably already going viral on social media platforms around the world. Tyler, get over here right now, Robert commanded in the voice he used during hostile corporate takeovers. But Tyler was too far gone to respond to parental authority, especially in front of all these strangers who were clearly taking the guard's side. No. Tyler screamed back at his father, these people are being mean to me. Make them stop. Buy this place and fire all of them? The absurdity of the demand would have been funny under different circumstances, but the crowd was now genuinely angry. Tyler had crossed several lines that couldn't be uncrossed, and his continued defiance was only making things worse. Palace security finally reached the scene, led by Sergeant David Walsh, a veteran security officer who had handled hundreds of tourist incidents over his career. He assessed the situation quickly. One agitated American child, angry crowd, international media attention building, and one of his guards maintaining perfect discipline under extreme provocation. Son, Sergeant Walsh said to Tyler in a firm but controlled voice. "You need to return to the designated tourist area immediately." Tyler looked at the security officer's uniform and badge, then made perhaps the worst decision of his young life. Instead of complying with the reasonable request, he decided to double down on his aggressive approach. "You can't tell me what to do," Tyler yelled at Sergeant Walsh. "I'm an American citizen. I have rights." This guard was being rude to me first. The lie was so blatant and obviously false that several people in the crowd actually laughed out loud. Guard Mitchell hadn't said a single word or made any gesture whatsoever during the entire confrontation, and dozens of people had witnessed the whole thing. Sergeant Walsh looked at Tyler with the expression of a man who had seen everything during his career, but was still occasionally surprised by human behavior. He turned to Robert Morrison, who was now standing behind his son with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration on his face. "Sir, I need you to remove your son from the restricted area immediately," Walsh said to Tyler's father. "If he doesn't comply voluntarily, we'll have to escort him out ourselves." The crowd fell silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Tyler stood between his father and the security sergeant, still face to face with Guard Mitchell, who continued to maintain his perfect ceremonial posture despite everything that had happened. The boy's tantrum had escalated beyond anything anyone had expected, and now there would have to be consequences. Robert Morrison grabbed his son's arm, trying to pull him away from the confrontation that was rapidly becoming an international embarrassment. Tyler jerked away from his father's grip with surprising strength, his face red with rage and humiliation at being corrected in front of so many strangers. "Don't touch me," Tyler screamed at his own father. "You're supposed to be on my side. Make them apologize to me. Buy this stupid place and make them all sorry." The crowd watched in stunned silence as the family drama unfolded alongside the disrespect toward the ceremonial guard. Many had pulled out their phones and were live streaming the incident on social media platforms, where viewer counts were climbing into the hundreds of thousands. Comments were pouring in from around the world, most expressing shock at the American child's behavior and admiration for the guard's incredible discipline. Guard Mitchell remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead. But internally, he was processing the situation with the tactical awareness he had developed during his military service. He could sense the crowd's energy shifting from entertainment to genuine anger. And he knew that sometimes crowds could become unpredictable when emotions ran high. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly British woman who had first spoken up, stepped closer to Tyler with her granddaughter Lucy beside her. Lucy was about Tyler's age, and she looked horrified by the American boy's behavior. She had been taught to respect authority figures, especially those in uniform, and she couldn't understand how someone could act so badly in public. "Tyler Morrison," Mrs. Thompson said, using the formal tone she had once used as a headmistress at a primary school, "your parents clearly failed to teach you basic respect for others. That young man you're harassing has probably seen more courage and sacrifice in one day than you'll see in your entire spoiled life." Tyler whirled around to face her again, his anger now completely out of control. "Shut up, old witch. Nobody asked for your stupid opinion. Go back to your nursing home where you belong." The crowd gasped at the insult. Calling an elderly woman names was bad enough, but Mrs. Thompson had clearly been trying to educate the boy about respect and proper behavior. Several British men in the crowd stepped forward, their faces dark with disapproval. "That's enough," said a tall man in a business suit who had been watching quietly until now. His name was William Hayes, and he was a veteran of the Royal Marines who now worked as a security consultant in London. He had served alongside guards like Mitchell and knew what kind of training and sacrifice went into their service, young man, Hayes continued. Addressing Tyler directly, "You've crossed every line of decent behavior today. That guard you're insulting served in combat zones while you were learning to tie your shoes. Show some respect." But Tyler was beyond listening to reason. The combination of jet lag, frustration, and his lifelong pattern of getting his way through tantrums had created a perfect storm of bad behavior. Instead of recognizing that he was outnumbered and in the wrong, he decided to escalate even further. "All you British people are just jealous of America?" Tyler shouted to the entire crowd. "Your teeth are bad, your food is terrible, and your soldiers are weak. That's why you needed us to save you in the war." The historical inaccuracy and crude stereotyping of his statement would have been offensive under any circumstances. But coming from a 12-year-old American tourist standing in front of Buckingham Palace, it struck the crowd as particularly outrageous. James Mitchell felt his jaw clench slightly at the mention of weak soldiers. He thought about his friend Danny, who had died from an improvised explosive device in Helmand Province. He thought about his sergeant, who had lost his leg to shrapnel while trying to rescue wounded civilians. He thought about the nightmares that still woke him some nights, and the therapy sessions that helped him process what he had seen and done in service to his country. But his training held firm. He was a Queen's Guard, and Queen's Guards did not break character for spoiled children, no matter how offensive their words became. His breathing remained steady, his posture perfect. His gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the crowd, Tyler's mother Sarah finally reached the front of the crowd and saw the full extent of her son's meltdown. She had been hoping this was just a minor incident that could be quietly resolved. But now, she could see that Tyler had managed to offend an entire crowd of British citizens and was being filmed by dozens of people. "Tyler James Morrison, you get over here this instant," she commanded in a voice that she rarely used with her son. "Apologize to everyone right now and come back to the hotel with us." Tyler looked at his mother with genuine surprise. She almost never spoke to him harshly, and she certainly never took other people's sides against him in public. The betrayal he felt at her words only added fuel to his anger. "No," he screamed back at her. "They started it. That stupid guard was ignoring me on purpose. I was just trying to take a picture and he was being mean." The lie was so obvious and ridiculous that several people in the crowd actually laughed out loud. Tyler had been standing directly in front of the guard for nearly 10 minutes, yelling insults and making demands. There was no way anyone could interpret Guard Mitchell's behavior as anything other than perfect professional restraint. Sergeant Walsh, the palace security officer, had been observing the situation and consulting with his supervisors via radio. The incident was already gaining international attention online, and there were concerns about how it might affect diplomatic relations between Britain and the United States. However, there were also clear protocols that had to be followed when civilians entered restricted areas and caused disturbances. "Mr. Morrison," Sergeant Walsh said to Tyler's father, "I need to inform you that your son has violated several palace security protocols. Entering restricted areas, disturbing ceremonial duties, and causing a public disturbance are all serious matters that we take very seriously." Robert Morrison felt his stomach drop. As a businessman, he understood the implications of what the security officer was saying. This wasn't just going to be an embarrassing family story. There could be actual legal consequences for Tyler's behavior. Officer Robert said, trying to use his most diplomatic business voice. "I apologize profusely for my son's behavior. He's tired from the flight and he's never seen anything like this ceremony before. We'll take him back to the hotel immediately and make sure this doesn't happen again." But Tyler wasn't finished causing problems. Hearing his father negotiate with the security officer made him feel like he was being abandoned by his own family. In his 12-year-old mind, his parents were supposed to fight for him against outsiders, not cooperate with them. "Dad, don't apologize to them," Tyler yelled. "Sue them instead. Sue the guard for being rude to me. Sue the palace for false advertising. Sue all these people for being mean to an American tourist." The crowd's reaction to this outburst was a mixture of disbelief and dark laughter. The idea that Tyler thought he could sue people for his own bad behavior was both absurd and telling about his entitled worldview. Mrs. Thompson shook her head sadly as she watched the scene unfold. "In my day," she said to her granddaughter, "children who behaved like this would have been taken straight home and taught some proper manners with a firm hand." Tyler heard her comment and decided to make one final catastrophic mistake. Instead of accepting that he was beaten and retreating with whatever dignity he had left, he chose to go on the attack one more time. "Your day was stupid," he screamed at Mrs. Thompson. "Nobody cares about your day. You're old and ugly, and your stupid country is weak and poor. America could destroy you if we wanted to." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The crowd fell completely silent except for the clicking of phone cameras capturing every moment of Tyler's complete meltdown. Even his own parents looked horrified by what their son had just said. "Guard." Mitchell finally allowed himself one small reaction. His eyes shifted slightly to look down at the child who had spent the last 15 minutes trying to provoke him. It was just a momentary glance, lasting perhaps 2 seconds, but it carried the weight of a professional soldier's assessment of someone who had crossed every line of decency and respect. Tyler saw the guard look at him and felt a moment of triumph, thinking he had finally gotten the reaction he wanted. But the look in Guard Mitchell's eyes wasn't anger or frustration, it was something much worse. It was disappointment mixed with pity. The look of a man who had seen real evil in the world and was saddened to see it growing in a child. The moment passed, and James returned his gaze to the horizon, his expression once again perfectly neutral. But that brief exchange had been captured by dozens of cameras, and it would soon become one of the most powerful images associated with the entire incident. The aftermath of Tyler's final outburst created a silence so profound, even the typical sounds of London traffic seemed muted. Hundreds of tourists stood frozen in disbelief, their phones still recording as they processed what they had just witnessed. The American boy's words had crossed from mere rudeness into something approaching international insult, and everyone present understood that this moment would have consequences, far beyond a simple family embarrassment. Sergeant Walsh stepped forward with the measured movements of someone who had dealt with countless security situations but recognized this one as uniquely problematic. His radio crackled quietly with urgent messages from his supervisors, who were monitoring social media feeds that showed the incident exploding across international news platforms. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," Walsh said in a voice that carried both authority and diplomatic restraint, "I'm going to need you to accompany me to the security office for a formal discussion about this incident. Your son's behavior has violated multiple palace protocols, and there are procedures that must be followed." Robert Morrison felt the blood drain from his face as he realized the full scope of what was happening. His business empire depended partly on international relationships and public reputation. Videos of his son insulting British veterans and threatening entire nations were already being shared millions of times across social media platforms. Stock prices for his companies would likely be affected by mourning. "Tyler," Robert said, in a voice that carried more anger than his son had ever heard from him, "you have created a disaster that could affect our entire family for years to come. Do you understand what you've done?" But Tyler was still lost in his tantrum-fueled rage, unable to process that his usual tactics had backfired so completely. In his 12-year-old mind, he was the victim of unfair treatment, and everyone around him was conspiring against him for reasons he couldn't comprehend. "I didn't do anything wrong," Tyler screamed, his voice now hoarse from 15 minutes of constant yelling. "That guard was being mean to me first. Everyone here is just picking on me because I'm American. It's not fair." Mrs. Thompson, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the entire incident, stepped closer to Tyler with her granddaughter still beside her. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of 7 decades of life experience and the authority of someone who had witnessed both the best and worst of human behavior. "Young man," she said, "I want you to look at that guard's face. Really look at it. Do you see those lines around his eyes? Those come from squinting through dust storms in Afghanistan while protecting people he'd never met. Do you see how straight he stands despite everything you've said to him? That's called honor, something your parents apparently forgot to teach you." Tyler glanced toward Guard Mitchell, who continued to maintain his perfect ceremonial posture despite the chaos swirling around him. For just a moment, something in the guard's stillness and dignity seemed to penetrate Tyler's anger, but the feeling was quickly overwhelmed by his embarrassment at being lectured by strangers. "I don't care about your stupid stories," Tyler yelled back at Mrs. Thompson. "He's just standing there doing nothing. Anyone can stand still. It's not hard." The crowd's reaction to this statement was immediate and intense. Several veterans in the group stepped forward, their faces showing a mixture of anger and disgust that Tyler was too young and self-absorbed to recognize as dangerous. William Hayes, The former Royal Marine spoke up with barely controlled fury. "Son, that man has probably carried wounded soldiers out of combat zones. He's probably held dying friends in his arms while under enemy fire. And you think what he's doing right now isn't hard? You couldn't last 5 minutes doing what he does every day." Tyler was beginning to realize that he had somehow united an entire crowd against him. But his privileged upbringing had never taught him how to back down gracefully from a confrontation. Instead, he did what he had always done when faced with opposition. He escalated. "Prove it, then," Tyler shouted at Hayes. "Make him do something. If he's so tough, make him fight someone. Make him show off instead of just standing there like a stupid statue." The suggestion that Guard Mitchell should abandon his post and engage in some kind of physical demonstration for a child's entertainment showed such a complete lack of understanding about military duty and ceremonial traditions that several people in the crowd actually gasped in shock. James Mitchell, still maintaining his position, felt a deep sadness wash over him. He had served his country in some of the most dangerous places on earth, had lost friends and comrades, had carried physical and emotional scars from his service, and had dedicated his life to something larger than himself. To hear a child reduce all of that to entertainment value was perhaps more painful than any of the direct insults had. Sarah Morrison finally reached her son and grabbed his arm with enough force to get his attention. "Tyler Morrison, you are going to stop talking right now, and you are going to apologize to everyone here." Starting with that guard, Tyler jerked away from his mother's grip, his sense of betrayal now complete. His own family was taking the side of strangers against him, something that had never happened in his sheltered life. "No," he screamed at his mother. "I'm not apologizing to anyone. They should apologize to me. This whole thing is stupid and boring, and I want to go home." The crowd watched as the Morrison family dynamic completely broke down in public. Tyler's parents had clearly lost control of their son years ago, and now they were facing the consequences in the most public and humiliating way possible. Sergeant Walsh had been receiving increasingly urgent messages through his earpiece, and he finally stepped forward to take control of the situation. "Mr. Morrison, I'm afraid this has gone beyond a simple tourist incident. Your son's behavior has been recorded by hundreds of people and is currently trending on international social media platforms. There are diplomatic considerations that need to be addressed." Robert Morrison understood immediately what the security officer was implying. An American child insulting British military traditions and threatening entire nations while standing in front of the Queen's residence was exactly the kind of incident that could strain international relationships and create political problems for both governments. "What do you need from us?" Robert asked, his business instincts finally overriding his parental protectiveness. "First, your son needs to be removed from the restricted area immediately," Walsh replied. "Then we'll need to have a formal discussion about how this incident will be handled officially. There are protocols for international incidents involving minors that we'll need to follow." Tyler heard the adults discussing him as if he weren't there, and his sense of abandonment intensified. "Stop talking about me like I'm not here." He yelled, "I'm right here. I can hear everything you're saying. I don't want to talk to any officials. I want to go back to the hotel and order room service." The complete disconnect between Tyler's childish demands and the serious nature of what he had created was so stark that it would have been comedic under different circumstances. Instead, it served to highlight just how unprepared he was to face the consequences of his actions. Mrs. Thompson turned to address the crowd that had gathered around the incident. "I think we've all seen enough here," she announced in her clear, authoritative voice. "This young man needs to learn some proper lessons from his parents, and that guard needs to be able to continue his important work without further distraction." The crowd began to slowly disperse, but not before many had shared their videos and photos across social media platforms. Within hours, Tyler Morrison's tantrum would be viewed by millions of people around the world, becoming a cautionary tale about entitled behavior and disrespect for military service. As the tourists moved away, Guard Mitchell remained in his position, his duty requiring him to maintain his post regardless of what had transpired. He had weathered the storm of Tyler's abuse with perfect discipline, But the incident would stay with him for a long time. Tyler found himself standing in an increasingly empty courtyard with his parents and several palace security officers, finally beginning to understand that his tantrum had consequences that went far beyond getting his way or not getting his way. The real world was about to teach him lessons that his privileged upbringing had left him completely unprepared to handle. The security office inside Buckingham Palace was nothing like Tyler had imagined royal buildings would look. Instead of gold-plated walls and crystal chandeliers, it was a functional workspace with plain desks, computer monitors, and filing cabinets. Tyler sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair between his parents, his earlier bravado completely deflated as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Sergeant Walsh sat across from the Morrison family with a thick folder of incident reports and a tablet, computers showing social media feeds that were updating in real time. The videos of Tyler's outburst had already been shared over 2 million times across various platforms, and news outlets from around the world were picking up the story. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison. Walsh began in a professional tone that somehow managed to be both respectful and stern. I need to explain the seriousness of what happened today. Your son didn't just cause a minor disturbance, he violated several security protocols and created what we classify as a diplomatic incident. Robert Morrison loosened his tie and wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. His phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from his business partners, public relations team, and news outlets wanting statements about the viral videos. What exactly are we looking at in terms of consequences? He asked. Walsh consulted his notes before responding. Entering restricted areas around the palace carries potential legal penalties. More seriously, your son's statements about America destroying Britain have been interpreted by some as threatening language, which creates international complications. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his chair, finally beginning to understand that his words had consequences beyond just making people angry. The fluorescent lights in the office seemed harsh after the natural sunlight of the courtyard. In the sterile environment made everything feel more serious and official. I didn't threaten anyone, Tyler mumbled, his voice much quieter than it had been during his public outburst. I was just saying America is stronger than Britain. That's not a threat. That's just true. Walsh looked at Tyler with the patient expression of someone who had dealt with many difficult situations involving young people. Son, when you're standing in front of the Queen's residence, insulting our military traditions, and talking about your country destroying ours, that goes well beyond expressing national pride. That's hostile language directed at our nation and our institutions. Sarah Morrison reached over and squeezed her son's hand, partly for comfort and partly to keep him from saying anything else that might make the situation worse. She had been watching the social media reactions on her own phone, and the comments were overwhelmingly critical of Tyler's behavior, their family's parenting. We understand this is serious, Sarah said to Walsh. What can we do to make this right? Tyler needs to learn from this experience. We want to handle this appropriately. Tyler pulled his hand away from his mother's grasp, still struggling with the idea that he was somehow the villain in this situation. Make what right? I didn't do anything that bad. Everyone is just being mean to me because I'm a kid. The door to the security office opened, and a woman in a formal business suit entered with another folder of documents. She introduced herself as Amanda Richardson, a liaison officer who handled international incidents involving tourists. The situation has escalated significantly in the past hour, Richardson informed the group as she sat down. The videos have been picked up by major news networks in both America and Britain. We're receiving inquiries from diplomatic offices, and there's been discussion about whether this requires formal government. Response. Robert Morrison felt his heart sink even further. As a businessman, he understood that this kind of international attention could have lasting effects on his companies, his family's reputation, and potentially their ability to travel freely in the future. Ms. Richardson, Robert said, my son made some very poor choices today, and he clearly needs to learn better behavior. But he's 12 years old. Surely this doesn't need to become a major international incident. Richardson consulted her tablet before responding. Mr. Morrison, age is certainly a factor we consider, but the nature of what was said and where it was said creates complications. Your son didn't just insult individuals. He made statements that could be interpreted as hostile toward our nation while standing at one of our most important national symbols. Tyler was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the adult conversation happening around him. Terms like diplomatic incident and international complications were beyond his understanding. But he could tell that everyone was treating his tantrum as something much more serious than he had intended. "I just wanted to take a picture with the guard," Tyler said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to cause all this trouble. I was just frustrated because he wouldn't look at me or talk to me." Walsh leaned forward in his chair, his expression softening slightly as he addressed Tyler directly. "Son, that guard you were yelling at is named James Mitchell. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan, where he saw friends killed and wounded while protecting people. When he stands guard here, he's continuing that service by protecting traditions that represent our entire nation. He wasn't ignoring you to be rude. He was doing his job with the same dedication he showed when bullets were flying." The information hit Tyler like a physical blow. In his 12-year-old worldview, adults existed primarily to serve his needs and wants. The idea that the guard had been focused on something more important than Tyler's desires was completely foreign to his experience. "I didn't know," Tyler whispered, genuine remorse creeping into his voice for the first time since the incident began. "I thought he was just being mean to me." Richardson made notes on her tablet as she observed Tyler's reaction. "Understanding begins with education, Tyler, but there are still consequences for what happened today. Your behavior was recorded and broadcast around the world. People saw an American child disrespecting British military traditions and making hostile statements about our country. That creates impressions that go beyond just your individual actions." Sarah Morrison spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "What kind of consequences are we talking about? Tyler clearly needs to learn from this. But he's still just a child who made some very bad choices." Walsh and Richardson exchanged glances before. Walsh responded. "There are several levels of consequences we need to discuss. First, there are the immediate security violations that occurred today. Second, there's the international attention and diplomatic considerations. And third, it's the question of what kind of education and accountability process would be appropriate for Tyler's age and the nature of his actions." Tyler looked up at his parents, suddenly feeling very young and scared. The weight of adult disapproval from strangers was different from anything he had experienced before. At home, when adults were upset with him, his parents usually interceded and fixed things. But now his parents seemed as concerned and serious as everyone else. "Am I going to jail?" Tyler asked in a small voice that barely carried across the room. "No, son," Walsh replied gently. "Children your age don't go to jail for incidents like this. But there will be consequences that help you understand why your behavior today was unacceptable and harmful." Richardson opened her folder and pulled out several documents. "We've prepared a comprehensive response plan that takes into account Tyler's age, the international nature of the incident, and the need for both accountability and education. This includes formal apologies, community service requirements, and educational components about military service and international relations." Robert Morrison reviewed the documents quickly, his business experience helping him understand the legal and diplomatic language. The consequences were serious but focused on education and community service, rather than punishment for its own sake. "Tyler," his father said in a voice that carried more authority than Tyler had ever heard from him, "you're going to complete every single requirement in these documents. And when we get home, there are going to be major changes in how our family operates. Your behavior today showed that we failed to teach you basic respect and consideration for others." Tyler nodded weakly, finally understanding that his tantrum had created problems that couldn't be solved by throwing more tantrums or having his parents by his way out of trouble. The real world had consequences that his privileged upbringing hadn't prepared him to handle. As the meeting continued, Tyler found himself thinking about Guard Mitchell, still standing in the courtyard, still doing his job with dignity despite everything Tyler had said to him. For the first time in his young life, Tyler began to understand that some things were more important than his own immediate wants and desires. 3 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Tyler Morrison stood in the lobby of a veterans rehabilitation center in Chicago, his hands shaking slightly as he held a handwritten letter. The community service requirements from his London incident had led him here, to a place that helped military veterans adjust to civilian life after combat injuries and trauma. The past 3 months had been the most difficult of Tyler's young life. The viral videos of his tantrum had followed him everywhere, to school, to restaurants, to family gatherings. Classmates who had once envied his wealth and privilege now whispered about that spoiled kid who yelled at the British soldier. Teachers looked at him differently, and even family friends seemed uncomfortable around him. His father's companies had suffered significant public relations damage, several international contracts being canceled and stock prices dropping for weeks after the incident. The Morrison family had become a cautionary tale about entitled parenting and the consequences of raising children without proper boundaries or respect for others. Tyler's phone, once his constant companion filled with social media apps and games, had been taken away entirely. His designer clothes had been replaced with simple, practical outfits from regular department stores. His allowance had been eliminated. He was required to do household chores and earn any spending money through work around their property. But perhaps the most significant change was the education program he was required to complete. Tyler had spent hours learning about military service, sacrifice, and the traditions he had insulted in London. He had read first-hand accounts from veterans of multiple conflicts, studied the history of the Queen's Guard, and written essays about respect, privilege, and personal responsibility. The letter in his hands was addressed to Guard James Mitchell, the man who had endured Tyler's tantrum with such incredible dignity and professionalism. Tyler had spent weeks writing and rewriting it, trying to find words that could somehow express his understanding of what he had done and his genuine remorse for his behavior. Tyler Morrison? A woman in a wheelchair approached him with a warm smile. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, the coordinator here. Are you ready for today's session?" Tyler nodded nervously. As part of his community service, he was required to spend time with veterans who were recovering from various physical and emotional injuries sustained during their military service. The program was designed to help him understand the real human cost of military service and the respect that veterans deserved. Dr. Chen led Tyler down a hallway lined with photographs of service members from various conflicts throughout American history. She stopped in front of a recreation room where several veterans were engaged in different activities, some playing chess, others working on art therapy projects, and a few participating in physical therapy exercises. "Before we go in," Dr. Chen said gently, "I want you to remember that these men and women have seen things and experienced things that most people never will. They've made sacrifices for their country that go far beyond what most of us can imagine. Your job here isn't to entertain them or to make yourself feel better. It's to listen, learn, and serve." Tyler had heard similar lectures many times over the past 3 months, but today they felt different. Today he was finally going to meet people who reminded him of Guard Mitchell. He was going to have to face what his behavior had really represented. In the recreation room, Tyler was introduced to several veterans. There was Marcus, a young man about Guard Mitchell's age, who had lost both legs to an improvised explosive device in Iraq. There was Linda, a woman in her 40s who suffered from severe PTSD after serving as a medic in Afghanistan. And there was Robert, an elderly Vietnam veteran who had spent decades dealing with both physical injuries and the psychological trauma of combat. Tyler's first task was simply to help serve lunch and spend time talking with the veterans about their experiences. As he pushed Marcus's wheelchair to the dining area, the veteran asked Tyler about his community service requirements. "So you're the kid from the London video?" Marcus said with a slight smile. "Man, that thing went everywhere. Even guys here were talking about it." Tyler felt his face burn with embarrassment. Even here, among people dealing with serious injuries and trauma, his tantrum was known and discussed. "I'm really sorry about that," Tyler said quietly. "I know I acted terribly. I didn't understand anything about what that guard was doing or why it was important." Marcus nodded thoughtfully as Tyler helped him get positioned at a table. "When I was deployed, we had ceremonial duties too, standing on our guard at memorial services for fallen soldiers. It might look like just standing around to outsiders, but those moments meant everything to us. They were about honoring sacrifice and showing respect for something bigger than ourselves. As Tyler served meals and listened to the veterans' stories throughout the day, he began to understand the profound disconnect between his privileged worldview and the reality of military service. These people had volunteered to risk their lives for abstract concepts like duty, honor, and country, ideas that had never meant anything to Tyler before his incident in London. During his break, Tyler pulled out the letter he had written to Guard Mitchell and read it one more time. Dear Guard Mitchell, I know you probably don't remember me, but I'm the American kid who yelled at you and said horrible things while you were on duty at Buckingham Palace 3 months ago. I've spent a lot of time learning about military service since then. I wanted you to know that I understand now how wrong I was and how sorry I am for disrespecting you and everything you represent. I know now that you served in Afghanistan and that you were doing something important and honorable when I interrupted you. I also know that my words probably hurt you in ways I didn't understand at the time. I'm working with veterans here in America now, trying to learn about service and sacrifice. I hope someday I can be the kind of person who deserves the protection and service that people like you provide. Thank you for your service. I'm truly sorry for my behavior. When Dr. Chen found Tyler later in the afternoon, he was sitting quietly with Robert, the Vietnam veteran, listening intently as the older man described the difficulties of returning home from an unpopular war. How's he doing? Dr. Chen asked Robert quietly. Better than I expected, Robert replied, glancing at Tyler with something approaching approval. Kid's got a long way to go, but he's actually listening. That's more than a lot of people do. As Tyler prepared to leave the Veterans Center that evening, he felt different than he had when he arrived. The stories he had heard, the people he had met, and the reality of what military service meant had changed something fundamental in his understanding of the world. His parents were waiting in the car outside, and Tyler could see that they looked different too. The past 3 months had been as educational for them as they had been for Tyler. They had been forced to confront their own failures as parents, and to recognize how their wealth and privilege had insulated Tyler from basic lessons about respect, responsibility, and consequences. How was today? His mother asked as Tyler got into the car. Hard, Tyler replied honestly, but good hard, I think. I'm learning a lot about things I never thought about before. As they drove home through Chicago traffic,
Tyler looked out the
window and thought about Guard Mitchell, still standing watch at Buckingham Palace, still serving his country with dignity and professionalism. Tyler had a long way to go before he could claim to understand what service and sacrifice really meant. But for the first time in his life, he was genuinely trying to learn. The letter to Guard Mitchell was mailed that evening, carrying with it Tyler's first genuine attempt at taking responsibility for his actions and acknowledging the humanity and dignity of someone he had tried to diminish. It was a small step, but it was a real one, toward becoming the kind of person who could contribute positively to the world rather than simply taking from it. The viral video of his tantrum would never disappear from the internet, but Tyler was slowly learning that he could choose what kind of person he became despite his past mistakes. The real question was whether he would have the courage and discipline to continue growing, even when it was difficult and uncomfortable.